April 7th, 1945. The Pacific Ocean. Pilots see a flash, resembling a nuclear explosion. A mushroom cloud of fire and smoke pierces the atmosphere, rising 6 kilometers into the sky. But this is not an atomic bomb. This is the death rattle of the Yamato. Welcome to the story of the most magnificent failure in the history of military engineering. Our theme today, Yamato, 70,000 tons of steel that did nothing. Why did Japan build a useless monster? Sounds harsh? Perhaps. But look at the facts. Before you stands a ship whose guns could strip the skin off a sailor with a single shockwave. Armor that no enemy battleship could pierce. Secrecy so absolute people were killed to maintain it. But why did this titan spend the entire war sitting in port, earning the shameful nickname Hotel Yamato? Why did the pride of the empire run from battle? And how did the combined resources of a nation end up at the bottom of the ocean in just 2 hours, destroyed by a swarm of flies? We are going to take this drama apart, bolt by bolt, from the blueprints hidden in vaults to the final suicide order that made no sense. Forget everything you thought you knew about naval warfare. Today, we show you how eras die. Imagine the halls of Washington in 1922. Men in stiff suits, the victors of the Great War, sit at tables to sign a document intended to stop the arms race forever, the Washington Naval Treaty. The world powers agreed, no more steel monsters. Strict limits were placed on fleet tonnage. For Japan, this was a moment of national humiliation. They were allowed a fleet only 60% the strength of the US or British navies. 5-5-3. It wasn't just a ratio, it was a sentence. Japanese admirals returned home with a cold calculation in their eyes. They knew that if war broke out, the Americans would simply crush them with numbers. For every 10 enemy battleships, Japan would have only 6. In a fair fight, that was guaranteed death. And so, in the silence of the high command, the doctrine of Kantai Kessen was born. The idea of the decisive battle. The plan was as simple as it was insane. The Japanese decided they didn't need many ships. They needed a few gods. They reasoned like this: if we cannot win with quantity, we will win with physics. We need a ship that can destroy the enemy from a distance where they cannot touch us. If American guns hit at 30 kilometers, ours must hit at 40. If their armor holds against a 16-inch shell, our shell must be 18 inches. This was the mathematics of fear. Japanese engineers began work on Project A-140. It was a quest for absolute superiority. They were creating a ship that was meant to be individually stronger than any possible opponent. And here, a factor enters the game that is rarely mentioned in textbooks, but loved by naval historians: the Panama Canal. The Japanese knew a secret detail. American battleships were limited by the width of the Panama Canal locks. If the US wanted to build a ship capable of fighting the Yamato on equal terms, it simply wouldn't fit through the canal to get from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And building 2 separate fleets was a colossal expense, even for America. They calculated everything. They weren't just building a battleship. They were building a trap for common sense. They believed one Yamato could engage and destroy 3, 4, or 5 Iowa-class battleships. It was a grand illusion. In the Japanese headquarters, they believed the war of the future would look like a duel of gentlemen on the high seas. Giant ships would line up and exchange volleys until one sank. They forgot one thing. Math is a precise science, but it does not account for the enemy's imagination. While the Japanese were casting the world's largest guns, engineers in other countries were already designing tiny motors for wooden planes. Picture the city of Kure in the late 1930s. This isn't just a naval base. It is a closed ecosystem where the very word Yamato is strictly forbidden. Even in official documents, the ship was known only by the faceless code Object Number 1. The Japanese command knew. If American intelligence learned the true size and caliber of this monster, the arms race would begin anew. So, they launched a machine of unprecedented secrecy. Around the dry dock where the giant was being born, they erected a massive fence of rice mats and wooden boards. Every window in the city that faced the harbor was boarded up or painted over. Residents were forbidden from looking toward the shipyards. The secret police, the Kempeitai, patrolled the streets. If you lingered your gaze on a harbor crane for too long, you might disappear by evening. But true paranoia reigned inside the design bureaus. Engineers were forbidden from taking even scraps of blueprints home. Every sheet of paper was numbered and returned to the safe at the end of the day. Lead designers were forced to memorize entire systems and mechanisms so as not to leave a paper trail. If two departments worked on different parts of the hull, they were forbidden from discussing their work with each other. No one, except a handful of men at the very top, saw the full picture. Even the workers at the shipyard didn't know exactly what they were building. They were told it was just a large aircraft carrier or a standard battleship. The irony is that when the Yamato first touched the water, most of those who assembled it were shocked by its true scale. And here we come to a moment that made the Japanese mathematicians sweat. Launching a giant like this isn't just a celebration. It is a physical catastrophe on a local scale. Engineers calculated that when the hull, weighing tens of thousands of tons, slid into the narrow harbor of Kure, it would displace so much water that it would create a man-made tsunami. They seriously feared the wave would flood coastal neighborhoods and toss fishing boats onto rooftops. Therefore, the launch was conducted in total secrecy, early in the morning, after ordering all coastal residents to leave their homes under the pretext of a drill. The water level in the harbor did indeed change so sharply during the launch that it was recorded by instruments on the other side of the bay. What did this cost the nation? One Yamato-class battleship cost Japan an amount equivalent to 1,000 modern tanks, or 120 locomotives. It was comparable to 1% of the entire national budget of the empire. Within the steel of the Yamato were melted the schools, hospitals, and roads that were never built. To understand what the Yamato was, forget everything you know about ships. Try to imagine 3 main battery turrets. Each turret weighed 2,800 tons. That is more than a modern destroyer with its entire crew, fuel, and ammunition. Just one gun, and there were 3 in each turret, weighed 160 tons. The Japanese called these weapons the Special Type 40 centimeter. This was another lie for the spies. In reality, the caliber was 46 centimeters, 18 inches of pure death. A shell from such a gun weighed nearly 1.5 tons. Imagine a family car filled with explosives flying toward a target at supersonic speed over a distance of 42 kilometers. At such a distance, the curvature of the Earth becomes a problem. But the Japanese solved that, too. At the top of the Yamato's superstructure sat a giant 15-meter rangefinder. It was the pinnacle of optical thought at the time. The lenses for it were hand-ground for months. In clear weather, Japanese gunners could see the masts of the enemy far beyond the horizon, where the Americans saw only empty water. But the power of attack is only half the story. The Yamato was meant to be immortal. Its armor belt was 410 millimeters thick. It was the finest steel the Empire's industry could produce. The ship's internal structure resembled a honeycomb, hundreds of watertight compartments designed to keep the giant afloat even if it took a dozen torpedoes. However, this power came with a terrible price. And I'm not talking about money. I'm talking about physics. When the Yamato fired all 9 of its main guns at once, reality around it literally ruptured. The pressure of the powder gases at the muzzle was so great that it could instantly kill anyone standing on the open deck. The shockwave didn't just hit the ears. It stripped the clothes off sailors and turned their internal organs into mush. Before every volley, sirens wailed across the entire ship, and special light panels demanded the immediate evacuation of the decks. Even the anti-aircraft crews had to hide in armored enclosures at that moment. If anyone stayed outside, they wouldn't just go deaf. They would cease to exist as a living organism. This was a ship that hated its own crew. December 16, 1941. Just 9 days after Japanese planes turned Battleship Row in Pearl Harbor into a flaming graveyard, the Yamato officially enters service. Here lies the greatest historical mockery. Japan's own aircraft carriers had just proven to the entire world the era of big guns was dead. A plane costing a few thousand yen could send a vessel costing hundreds of millions to the bottom. But admirals in Tokyo refused to believe it. They looked at the Yamato and saw not just a weapon, but a sacred symbol. The name of the ship itself is an ancient, poetic name for Japan. And this very symbolism became its curse. The ship was too big to lose, and too expensive to risk. While the Japanese army bled out in the jungles of Oceania, while sailors on destroyers suffocated from the heat in iron boxes, The Yamato turned into what the Navy whispered was the Hotel Yamato. And that was not a metaphor. Inside the steel monster, life flowed as if the war didn't exist. It was the only ship in the Imperial Navy with a full air conditioning system. In the tropical heat of Truk Atoll, where the fleet was stationed, the officers of the Yamato enjoyed the coolness of their cabins. While ordinary soldiers on the islands boiled soup from leather belts and died of malaria, the battleship's wardroom served fresh meat, fish, and vegetables delivered by refrigerator ships from the mainland. But most shocking for the Japanese Navy was the presence of ice and ice cream machines on board. In the 1940s, for Japan, this was akin to space technology. Imagine this picture. A few hundred miles away, the brutal battle for Guadalcanal is raging. Men are rotting alive in trenches, while on the deck of the Yamato, officers in snow-white uniforms drink whiskey on the rocks and listen to jazz. Admiral Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, made the Yamato his flagship, but he almost never took it out to sea. Why? The answer is as mundane as it is nauseating. Fuel. The Yamato was insatiable. In one day of active steaming, it burned as much fuel oil as an entire fleet of destroyers would need for a week. Japan, cut off from oil sources, simply could not afford to let this beast roam the ocean. Consequently, the greatest battleship in history turned into the world's most expensive and well-protected floating hotel. It sat at anchor month after month, while the war it was created for rapidly changed its face. The crew began to decay. Sailors trained to operate the most powerful guns spent months painting decks and polishing brass. Morale plummeted. Men realized they were merely props in a play that the Japanese command was already losing. But even when the situation became critical, when the Americans began capturing island after island, the Yamato continued to sit. It was being saved for that decisive battle that existed only in the heads of old-school admirals. They waited for the moment when American battleships would line up and present their broadsides. October 1944, the largest naval battle in human history, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Japan throws everything it has left into the fight. Operation Shogo was desperate. Lure out the main American forces and then strike the defenseless landing ships off the Philippines with a powerful force of battleships. And there, on the horizon, appears the Yamato. This was the moment it was created for. For the first time in its life, the steel monster saw the enemy not through a training rangefinder, but in the sights of its combat guns. But the Yamato didn't find American battleships in its path. Instead, it faced Taffy 3. This was a group of tiny escort carriers, which sailors called jeep carriers for their fragility, and a handful of destroyers. From the Yamato's perspective, this wasn't an armada. It was trash. The Americans didn't have a single large caliber gun. Only 5 inches of steel against the 46 centimeters of the Japanese beast. At 6:59 in the morning, the Yamato opens fire. Distance, 32 kilometers. A single volley from this ship weighed more than the entire broadside of all American destroyers in the area combined. The Japanese used special shells with colored dyes, red, yellow, blue, so that each battleship could see the splashes of its own hits. The ocean turned into a ghastly palette of death. It seemed Taffy 3 was doomed. But then something happened that Japanese mathematics didn't account for. The madness of the brave. American destroyers, like the Johnston, didn't run. They attacked the battleships like enraged terriers against a bear. They laid smoke screens, hid in rain squalls, and launched torpedoes. And here, the Yamato showed its main weakness. Its immense weight made it tactically sluggish. When the American destroyers launched a spread of torpedoes, Admiral Kurita ordered the Yamato to begin an evasive maneuver. And this maneuver became a catastrophe. The most powerful ship in the world was forced to turn its stern to the enemy and head north for 10 precious minutes to escape the torpedoes. In the heat of battle, when every second counted, the Yamato was simply walking away from the fight. It was running from tiny tin cans that couldn't even pierce its belt armor. When the Yamato finally turned back, the battlefield had turned into chaos. Due to smoke, rain, and radio interference, Admiral Kurita lost control of the fleet. He saw splashes from his shells and believed he was sinking heavy carriers, when in reality they were just escorts. He thought he was facing the entire U.S. Third Fleet. At that moment, something broke in the Japanese commander's head. Having an overwhelming advantage, with a battleship at hand that could have single-handedly finished off the remnants of the American group, Kurita gave the order to retreat. April 1945. Japan is no longer fighting for victory. It is fighting to die beautifully. American troops had begun landing on Okinawa. This was the last line of defense before Japan itself. In Tokyo, they knew, if Okinawa falls, the empire falls. And then a question was asked that decided the fate of 3,000 men. Emperor Hirohito, after hearing a report on the hopeless situation at the front, dryly asked his admirals, "Where is the fleet? Is it possible we don't have a single ship left to defend Okinawa?" The admirals had no answer that could satisfy a god. The fleet had effectively ceased to exist. The remnants of the combat ships sat without fuel, turned into floating anti-aircraft batteries. But the emperor's question was taken as an order. Even if it made no military sense, the Yamato had to go to sea. Thus was born Operation Tengo, Operation Heaven 1. The plan was so insane that some staff officers openly called it murder. The Yamato, accompanied by a light cruiser and 8 destroyers, was to break through to Okinawa. It had no air cover, not a single plane. It had to sail hundreds of miles under the sights of hundreds of American aircraft. The mission was as follows: break through to the shores of Okinawa, beach itself, and turn into a stationary but ultra-powerful artillery battery. When the ammunition ran out, the crew was to go ashore and join the infantry in the attack. It was a one-way trip. There is a myth that the Yamato was given fuel for only one way. This isn't quite true. Quartermasters secretly drained the remaining oil from other ships to give the giant a chance to at least maneuver in battle. But everyone understood. It wasn't coming back. The atmosphere on board in the final 24 hours was eerie. Officers were ordered to issue sake to the crew. On the deck of the battleship, which was always known for the strictest discipline, farewell drinking parties began. Men wrote their last letters home, clipped locks of hair and fingernails to send to their families for burial. And here, a moment occurred that shows the full depth of the Japanese tragedy. The ship's commander, Admiral Ito, ordered all young cadets and 6 sailors to leave the vessel. He didn't want to take those who had their whole lives ahead of them. But when the boats approached the hull, chaos erupted. Young men, raised in the spirit of Bushido, sobbed and refused to go ashore. They shouted that they were being robbed of the honor to die for the emperor. Many had to be literally pushed off the deck by force. On the evening of April 6th, the Yamato weighed anchor. There wasn't a single Japanese fighter in the sky over the harbor. The silence was ominous. As the giant hull of the battleship began to slowly exit the bay, sailors on other ships lined the decks and saluted in silence. They knew they were seeing the Yamato for the last time. April 7th, noon. The sky over the East China Sea is overcast with low clouds. For the Yamato's anti-aircraft gunners, this was the worst-case scenario. American planes could emerge from the clouds just a couple of kilometers from the ship, leaving only seconds to react. At 12:32, radar picked up the first wave. This wasn't a raid, it was an invasion. 386 planes. Imagine that sky. Helldiver dive bombers, Avenger torpedo bombers, and Hellcat fighters circling the Japanese formation like a pack of hyenas around a wounded lion. The Yamato came to life. 150 anti-aircraft guns opened fire simultaneously. The ship was enveloped in such a dense cocoon of smoke and fire that its silhouette was no longer visible. The Japanese used their famous Sanshikidan shells, so-called beehive shells. Upon detonation, they released thousands of incendiary tubes, creating a wall of fire in the sky. It looked spectacular, almost like fireworks, but in reality, it was terribly ineffective. American pilots simply flew through the fire. Admiral Mark Mitcher gave the order that became the Giant's death sentence. He ordered all torpedo bombers to attack strictly on one side, the port side. Why? American tacticians knew the Yamato was almost impossible to sink just by punching holes in its hull. But if all hits were concentrated on one side, the ship would take on water and capsize under its own weight. The first two torpedoes slammed into the port side at 12:45. The Giant shuddered but didn't even slow down. For 70,000 tons of steel, these were just scratches. But the attacks didn't stop for a second. The Americans worked like an assembly line. While one group went into a dive, dropping armor-piercing bombs on the deck, another group flew low over the water, releasing torpedoes. Inside the Yamato, hell began. The roar from direct hits was so powerful that men lost consciousness from concussions without even being wounded. The lighting failed. In narrow corridors flooded with oil and water, sailors tried to fight for the ship's survival in total darkness. By 1340, the list to the port side reached 15 degrees. The ship began to tilt dangerously. And here, one of the most horrific episodes in naval history occurred. To level the battleship and prevent it from capsizing, the damage control officers decided on counter-flooding. They opened the sea chests and let seawater into the starboard engine and boiler rooms. The problem was that there were people there. Hundreds of stokers and engineers were still working at the boilers. They had no orders to evacuate. A short command went over the phones, and in an instant, tons of ocean water flooded the compartments. 300 men were drowned alive by their own officers so that the battleship could stay upright for a few more minutes. But it didn't help. More torpedoes continued to rip into the port side. The list increased to 20 degrees. The massive main turrets, weighing 3,000 tons each, began to slide off their mountings under their own weight. The Yamato was losing speed. Its deck now resembled a steep mountain slope, down which men were sliding into the raging ocean. The explosion was of such force that American pilots several kilometers away felt their planes tossed upward by the shockwave. A ball of fire rose over the ocean, turning in a second into a black pillar of smoke. This was the funeral pyre of an empire. Nearly 3,000 tons of powder and shells detonated simultaneously, tearing the Yamato's hull in half. At that moment, time stopped for those in the water. The few who managed to jump from the deck before the explosion described it as the end of the world. First, a blinding flash. Then, a sound that was more like an earthquake. And then, darkness descended on the ocean. A massive cloud of smoke and soot blocked the sun, and black rain began to fall from the sky, a mixture of water, oil, and ash. But the worst began a few seconds later. As the massive mass of metal began to sink rapidly to the bottom, a giant vortex emerged. It was a water spout that sucked in everything living. Survivors recalled being dragged down like wood chips into the icy abyss. People clung desperately to wreckage, but the force of the vacuum was irresistible. Of the 3,332 crew members, only 200 remained on the surface. Those who survived floated in thick, viscous fuel oil. The oil got into their eyes and mouths, making it hard to breathe. American planes circled over the site of the sinking for a while longer, finishing off the remaining destroyers, but they no longer paid attention to the people in the water. The execution was complete. In Japan itself, the sinking of the Yamato was kept secret. Officially, it wasn't reported even to the families of the fallen. The Admiralty feared that news of the death of the unsinkable symbol would finally break the nation's spirit. Wives and mothers of the sailors continued to write letters to a ship that already lay at a depth of 340 meters, torn into two pieces. Only in 1985 was an expedition able to locate the battleship's wreckage. Footage from deep-sea vehicles shocked the world. The Yamato didn't just sink. It looked as if it had been passed through a giant meat grinder. The bow section lies separately, tilted on its side. The stern is overturned. The massive main battery turrets have fallen out of their sockets and lie nearby, resembling abandoned castles. There, in the eternal darkness and silence, rest the remains of the greatest warship in history. It lies there as a monument to human stubbornness, rusted iron that was once a nation's dream of world domination. When we look at the story of the Yamato today, it is easy to succumb to the temptation of calling the Japanese admirals fools. But the truth is much more frightening. They weren't fools. They were the best at what they did. They were masters of a war they understood down to the smallest detail. The tragedy is that this war ended before the Yamato was even launched. This ship became a monument to the greatest cognitive bias in military history. Psychologists call it the sunk cost fallacy. Japan invested so much money, so much steel, and so much national pride in this battleship that admitting its uselessness would have meant admitting the entire path of the empire was wrong. Let's step away from the aesthetics of giant guns for a second and look at the dry numbers. The cost of one Yamato is approximately 2,000 Zero fighters. It is 50 destroyers. It is tens of thousands of tanks that the Japanese infantry so desperately lacked on the islands. If these resources had been spent on radar development, modern communication systems, or pilot training, the history of the Pacific Front might have looked very different. But the Japanese command chose a symbol over efficiency. They built a god when they needed soldiers. The Yamato is an object lesson in what happens when technological progress outpaces human imagination. It was the highest point of naval artillery thought, a masterpiece of the analog world that collided with the first signs of the digital world, a world of aerial calculations, mass production, and electronic warfare. There is an old Japanese saying, "The three most useless things in the world are the Great Wall of China, the Egyptian pyramids, and the battleship Yamato." The Japanese themselves realized their mistake too late. They created a Leviathan that was too expensive to use and too big to lose. In the end, it spent most of the war hiding in ports, eating up the country's resources, and providing no benefit. But there is a certain tragic beauty in this story. The Yamato didn't go down at the hand of another giant. It wasn't defeated by an equal opponent. It was destroyed by the logic of time itself. Its death proved, on the new chessboard of war, kings no longer decide the outcome of the game. The outcome is decided by pawns, if there are enough of them and they have wings. Today, the wreckage of the Yamato is slowly dissolving in salt water at a depth of 300 meters. It serves as a home for deep-sea fish and a reminder for us. In a world where technology changes every few years, there is always a risk of starting to build your own Yamato. Something grandiose, expensive, and incredibly powerful that will be obsolete before you even finish the work. The story of this battleship teaches us one important thing. The winner is not the one with the biggest caliber. The winner is the one who knows when to let go of old ideas and face the future, no matter how terrifying it may seem. The largest battleship in human history performed only one final task. By its death, it proved to the entire world that battleships were no longer needed. It was a very expensive period at the end of an entire chapter of human civilization.